Jackson Hole, Wyoming. True home alone. Horror stories that turned real. Jackson Hole is the kind of place people describe as peaceful. Wide valleys, snow-covered roads, cabins tucked so far apart that lights at night feel like accidents rather than neighbors. During the day it looks untouched. At night it feels exposed. Out there, being alone is not unusual. It is expected. And that expectation is exactly what makes fear grow quietly instead of all at once. Winter stretches time in Jackson Hole. Nights come early and stay long. Snow swallows sound, turning the world into something muffled and distant. Wind presses against walls. Old houses settle and shift. The heater clicks on and off. Every small noise stands out because there is nothing to compete with it. No traffic, no crowds, no quick help. When something interrupts that silence, you notice immediately. Most people who live there understand the rules. You lock your doors. You plan ahead. You assume that if something goes wrong, you are responsible for handling it alone, at least for a while. Emergency response can take time. Roads disappear under snowdrifts. Phone signals fade without warning. Isolation is part of daily life, not a mistake. What makes the stories you're about to hear unsettling is not what happened, but how little explanation followed. These are not break-ins that left damage behind, not ghost stories passed around for entertainment, not urban legends built on exaggeration. These are accounts from people who were alone in their homes, doing ordinary things when something shifted. A sound that responded instead of repeating. A presence felt without being seen. A figure outside that did not behave like a person should. In each case, the house remained locked. The evidence never matched the fear. Authorities searched and found nothing that made sense. And yet the people who lived through these nights never went back to feeling safe in the same way again. Because when you are truly alone and something acknowledges you from the darkness, the question is no longer what it is. The question becomes why it chose that moment. These are true Home Alone horror stories from Jackson Hole, Wyoming that turned real. And once you hear them, the silence may not feel empty anymore. She rented the cabin because she needed quiet. Not the trendy kind of quiet people brag about online, but real quiet. The kind that clears your head because there is nothing around to distract you. A few days away from screens, noise, and constant conversations. Jackson Hole felt perfect for that. Beautiful during the day, calm at night, and far enough out that no one would bother her. The cabin sat off a narrow, snow-lined road that looked like it ended in the trees. When she drove in, she passed only two other properties, both dark and silent, set back behind fences half buried in drifts. The last stretch to her place was unplowed but passable, packed snow crunching under her tires. The air outside was sharp and cold, the kind that stings your lungs in a clean way. Everything smelled like pine and frozen earth. Inside, the cabin felt warm and ordinary, small but comfortable. Wood walls, thick curtains, a simple kitchen, a living room with a couch facing a stone fireplace. The heater clicked on with a dry metallic sound, then hummed steadily. She walked through each room once, checking the windows and locks out of habit. Everything closed properly, everything latched. She wasn't paranoid, just practical. Out here, you didn't leave things open. The first evening passed without anything unusual. She cooked a basic dinner, unpacked, and sat with a book while the wind moved faintly through the trees outside. The kind of wind that makes branches scrape gently against one another. The cabin creaked once or twice as it adjusted to the heat inside. It all felt normal, safe, exactly what she came for. The second night was colder. You could feel it in the way the windows tightened and the floorboards seemed harder under your feet. The sky outside turned black early, and the darkness felt heavier because of the snow. It reflected almost no light, swallowing the view beyond the glass. When she stepped outside briefly to bring in firewood, the silence hit her immediately. No distant traffic, no voices, no dogs. Only the faint whisper of wind and the soft squeak of snow under her boots. She locked the door behind her and double-checked it, tugging the handle once to make sure it caught. Then she went back to the living room, turned on a lamp and put on something quiet in the background, just to soften the silence. She wasn't afraid. She just didn't like how absolute the quiet could feel when you were alone. Around 9 p.m., she sent a couple of messages to a friend, mostly to reassure someone knew where she was. The signal was weak, but the texts went through. She made tea. She took a shower. She moved through the cabin slowly, enjoying how simple everything felt. By 10:30, she settled into bed in the small bedroom at the back of the house. The heater cycled on and off, clicking softly, then humming again. The wind picked up outside for a while, brushing against the roof. The house made the usual noises old cabins make. A faint pop from wood contracting. A soft creak, nothing that stood out. She was almost asleep when she heard the first sound that made her open her eyes. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even clearly threatening. It sounded like a single knock, not on the front door, on the wall beside her bed. She lay still, eyes open, staring at the dark outline of the wall. The knock had been too precise to ignore, not the random creak of wood or the dull thud of ice shifting outside. It was sharp, contained, deliberate. One solid tap, followed by nothing. Her breathing slowed instinctively as she listened for a follow-up that never came. She told herself it was the cabin settling. Old structures made strange noises, especially in cold weather. Still, she didn't move right away. She waited, counting the seconds in her head, listening to the heater hum and the faint whisper of wind sliding past the windows. The silence returned to normal, thick but familiar. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes again. The second knock came a minute later. Same spot, same pressure, same measured sound. This time she sat up. Her heart rate jumped, a sudden rush of awareness flooding her chest. The knock hadn't come from the door or a window. It had come from inside the house, from the wall separating her bedroom from the living room, the space she had walked through several times already that night. Empty, quiet, locked. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, feet pressing into the cold wooden floor. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and warm metal from the heater, but underneath that was something else now. A sharper note, clean but wrong, like cold air carrying the trace of machinery. She paused, trying to place it, then dismissed the thought before it could grow. She crossed the bedroom slowly and cracked the door open. The living room lamp was still on, casting a soft pool of light across the floor. The furniture sat exactly where she had left it. Nothing looked disturbed. No shadows moved, no sound followed her movement. She stepped fully into the living room. That was when she noticed the temperature difference. The air felt cooler here than it should have been, not dramatically but enough to register on her skin. She glanced toward the front door. It was still closed, locked. The deadbolt hadn't moved. The curtains over the windows hung undisturbed. No gaps, no drafts. She walked closer to the wall where the knock had come from and placed her hand against it. The wood felt cold, colder than the surrounding walls, cold enough that she pulled her hand back instinctively. A faint chill lingered in her fingers. She pressed her palm against the adjacent wall. That one felt normal, warmed by the heater and the insulated interior. The difference was subtle but undeniable. She stood there for several seconds, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement of any kind. She told herself to stop overthinking it. Isolation makes your mind work harder than it should. You start assigning intention to coincidence. She turned back toward the bedroom, ready to put the incident behind her. That was when the knock came again. This time, it wasn't beside her bed. It came from above. A dull, hollow sound traveled through the ceiling, followed by a soft scrape, like something shifting its weight across the floor overhead. She stared up, pulse pounding, suddenly very aware that the cabin did not have a second story. She didn't move at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling, as if staring hard enough might force the sound to explain itself. The scrape came again, slower this time, dragging across the wood above her head. It wasn't heavy enough to sound like someone walking, but it wasn't light either. It carried intention, direction. Whatever caused it was moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Her breath caught in her chest. The logical part of her mind scrambled for explanations. Animals sometimes got into crawl spaces, squirrels, raccoons. But this cabin didn't have an attic you could access from inside, and the sound wasn't the chaotic scurrying she'd heard before in other places. It was measured, careful. as if whoever was up there knew exactly how much noise they were making. She backed toward the kitchen without taking her eyes off the ceiling. The lamplight seemed dimmer now, stretched thin by the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. The heater clicked off abruptly, plunging the cabin into a heavier silence. Without the hum, every small sound felt magnified. The scrape above her stopped. Then something tapped the ceiling. Once, directly above where she stood. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. She forced herself to move, stepping into the kitchen and grabbing her phone from the counter. No signal. The screen showed one faint bar that vanished as soon as she touched it. She tried again. Nothing. The silence in the cabin felt different now, like it was waiting. A soft thump came from the living room wall, then another. The knocks had changed position. They weren't random anymore, they were following her. She retreated toward the front door, moving slowly, listening for changes in the sound. The smell returned stronger now, cutting through the warm wood scent. Cold air mixed with metal and something damp, like fabric that had been left too long without drying. Her stomach tightened as the smell filled the small space. The door was still locked. She checked it again anyway, twisting the deadbolt until it resisted firmly. The windows showed nothing but darkness and snow reflecting faint starlight. No movement, no figures. The outside looked empty and untouched. Above her, something shifted again. This time, the ceiling creaked under weight. Not enough to break, enough to suggest presence. She whispered for it to stop, the words slipping out before she could stop herself. The sound of her own voice startled her, thin and fragile in the quiet. For a moment, nothing happened. She stood there shaking, phone clutched in her hand, breath shallow and uneven. Then the ceiling answered. 3 slow taps, evenly spaced, directly above her head. At the same time, the knock came from the wall beside the front door. The cabin felt smaller now, pressed in from all sides. The sounds no longer circled randomly. They coordinated above, beside, behind. She felt watched without seeing anything, tracked by something that understood where she was at every moment. She stepped back, bumping into the kitchen counter, and that was when she realized the most unsettling part. The sounds weren't just reacting to her movement anymore, they were anticipating it. Her instincts finally took over. Whatever was happening was no longer something she could explain away, and staying still felt more dangerous than moving. She decided to leave, not calmly, not later, now. She grabbed her coat from the back of a chair and stepped toward the door, keeping her movement slow, deliberate, as if sudden motion might provoke whatever was tracking her. The moment her hand touched the doorknob, the sounds stopped. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. No wind, no heater, no movement above or beside her. It felt like the cabin itself had gone hollow. Her ears rang slightly as if adjusting to pressure. She stood frozen, fingers wrapped around the cold metal, waiting for something to happen. Then the heater clicked back on. The sound made her flinch hard enough that she nearly dropped her phone. Warm air pushed through the vents again, but the smell did not fade. It thickened, filling the cabin with that same metallic edge, sharper now, almost burning. Her eyes watered. She gagged softly and pulled her sleeve over her mouth. Behind her the floor creaked, one slow shift of weight, directly in the living room. She did not turn around. She could feel it, without looking. The space behind her felt occupied in a way that had nothing to do with sight. The pressure returned, heavier than before, settling across her shoulders, pinning her in place. The silence wrapped tighter, swallowing even the sound of her breathing. Something moved closer, not rushing, not stalking, simply closing distance with complete certainty. The smell surged again, hot and invasive. The air near her neck felt warmer, as if a body stood just inches away without touching her. Her vision narrowed, darkening at the edges. Panic spiked violently now, erasing any remaining restraint. She wrenched the door open. Cold air exploded into the cabin, sharp and clean, cutting through the smell instantly. Snow blew across the threshold, scattering across the floor. She stumbled forward, boots slipping on ice as she burst out onto the porch. The darkness outside felt vast and exposed, but it was real, tangible. She sucked in a lungful of freezing air and kept moving. Behind her, the cabin made a sound she would never forget. Not a creak, not a knock. The door slammed shut on its own with enough force to rattle the windows. She ran. The snow crunched loudly under her boots as she fled toward her car, heart pounding, lungs burning. The cold bit into her face, but she welcomed it. It grounded her. She didn't look back until she reached the driver's side door, hands shaking so badly she dropped her keys once before managing to unlock it. She dove inside and slammed the door, locking it instantly. The cabin stood silent behind her, lights still on, door closed, no movement at the windows. She sat there shaking, engine running, headlights cutting through falling snow. Her breath came in ragged bursts. She stared at the cabin, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Then she noticed the frost forming on the inside of her windshield, not spreading evenly, but in the shape of fingerprints, pressed from the inside, facing her. She drove through the night without stopping. The road out of Jackson Hole felt longer than it had earlier, the snow blurring the edges of everything beyond her headlights. Every time she glanced at the rearview mirror, she expected to see the cabin lights shrinking behind her, but the darkness swallowed them almost immediately. The fingerprints on the windshield faded as the heater warmed the glass, leaving no trace, as if they had never been there at all. She didn't report what happened right away. There was nothing to report. No damage, no forced entry, no evidence that would survive a conversation with anyone trained to look for rational answers. When she returned the keys the next morning, she only said she had to leave early. The man at the desk nodded, unsurprised, like he'd heard similar things before and learned not to ask. Weeks later, she noticed changes she couldn't ignore. Certain sounds made her tense. A knock in an apartment hallway sent her pulse racing. The smell of warm metal, even something as harmless as a space heater, made her stomach turn. She stopped sleeping with bedroom doors closed. She needed to see the space around her at all times. Out of curiosity, she searched for the cabin online. It wasn't listed anymore. The rental page was gone. The address no longer appeared on maps. When she called the company to ask about it, the person on the line paused too long before answering. They told her the property had been taken offline due to maintenance issues. When she pressed for details, the call ended abruptly. Months after that, she received an email meant for someone else. A confirmation message for a booking at the same location, dated in the future. The name wasn't familiar. The dates were during winter. She replied to say there must have been a mistake. No one answered. Sometimes, late at night, she still wakes to a sound that feels too deliberate to be coincidence. A single knock, sharp, controlled, close enough that it feels personal. When she checks, there is never anyone there. No explanation, no pattern she can follow. But she no longer doubts one thing. Whatever was inside that cabin didn't force its way in. It was already there. He had lived on that stretch of road for nearly 8 years, long enough that the isolation no longer felt strange. The house sat alone on a shallow rise overlooking a long, straight rural road that cut through open land before disappearing into trees miles away. In summer, the distance felt comforting. In winter, it felt absolute. When snow came down hard, the road vanished entirely, erased into a white plain that reflected moonlight and swallowed sound. That night, a storm was moving in fast. The sky had darkened earlier than expected, clouds thick and low, pressing down on the valley. He finished dinner just after sunset, rinsed his plate and checked the windows out of habit. Snow hadn't started yet, but the air had that heavy stillness that always came before it, the kind that makes even familiar places feel paused. He lived alone by choice. Neighbors were miles away and emergency services took time to reach this area even on clear days. You learn to be self-sufficient. You learn to trust routines. Lock the doors before dark. Keep lights on in occupied rooms. Leave the porch light off unless you expect someone, so it doesn't reflect back at the windows. The power flickered once around 8 p.m., then steadied. He didn't think much of it. That happened often when weather rolled in. He turned on a lamp in the living room and settled into his chair, the television on low volume more for presence than attention. The house made its usual winter sounds, pipes ticking, wood contracting, wind brushing against siding. Around 9:15, he got up to draw the curtains in the front room. That was when he saw the figure on the road. At first, he thought it was a trick of light. The snow hadn't started yet, but the road reflected just enough glow from the sky that shapes could distort at a distance. He leaned closer to the window, squinting. The figure stood far down the road, right where the pavement dipped slightly, before vanishing into shadow, too far away to make out details, just a vertical shape against the pale ground. He waited for it to move. It didn't. No walking, no shifting, no signs of a car nearby. Just someone standing there perfectly still, facing toward the house. He told himself it was a neighbor checking conditions, maybe someone pulled over with their lights off. But there were no tire tracks leading to that spot. The road looked untouched. He stepped back, switched off the lamp and watched again from the darkness inside the house. The figure remained, not approaching, not leaving, just standing there, as if waiting. He stayed at the window longer than he meant to, watching for any sign that would make the situation make sense. A raised arm, a step forward, the glow of a phone screen. Nothing happened. The figure remained fixed in place, a dark interruption in an otherwise empty stretch of road. The longer he stared, the more his eyes struggled to hold onto it, as if the distance itself resisted focus. He checked the clock. Only a few minutes had passed. He turned away briefly to grab binoculars from a shelf near the door, something he used occasionally to watch wildlife along the tree line. When he looked back through the glass, his stomach tightened. The figure was closer. Not by much. Just enough that the change was undeniable. It now stood past the shallow dip in the road, where the pavement rose again toward his property. There were still no footprints behind it. The snow hadn't fallen yet, but the thin dusting from earlier that day should have shown disturbance. The road remained smooth and unmarked. He raised the binoculars with shaking hands. The image refused to sharpen. No matter how he adjusted the focus, the figure stayed indistinct, like a shape cut out of the night, rather than a person standing in it. He could tell it was roughly human in height, but that was all. No coat, no hat, no outline he could recognize. The longer he looked, the more uncomfortable he felt, as if his eyes were sliding off something they weren't meant to understand. He lowered the binoculars and backed away from the window. The house felt quieter than before. The television murmured faintly behind him, but the sound felt thin, fragile, like it might stop at any moment. He walked to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, trying to slow his breathing. His hands trembled slightly as he set the glass down. He told himself not to overreact. Isolation does strange things to perception. He knew that. When he returned to the window, the figure had moved again. It now stood at the edge of his property line, close enough that he should have been able to see more detail. He still couldn't. The porch light was off, leaving the yard in shadow, but the pale ground reflected enough ambient light that he could see where the road ended and his land began. The figure stood just beyond the fence, perfectly aligned with the gate, facing the house directly. His heart hammered in his chest. He checked the door locks again, testing each one with more force than necessary. They held. The windows were closed, curtains drawn. Everything was secure. He told himself that whoever stood outside could not get in, that the distance, the locked doors, the walls, all still meant something. Then the power flickered again. The lights dimmed for less than a second. When they came back on, the figure was gone. He exhaled sharply, a rush of relief washing through him so fast it made his knees weak. He told himself it was over, that whoever it had been moved on, that the storm had scared them away. He turned the lamp back on and let the room fill with warm light again. A soft sound came from the front porch, not a knock. The scrape of something heavy shifting its weight against wood. The scrape came again, slower this time, like someone adjusting their footing carefully so it wouldn't make too much noise. The porch boards answered with a low groan that traveled up through the walls and into his chest. He stood still in the center of the living room, listening, every muscle tight, afraid that moving would draw attention. He waited for a knock. None came. Instead, the sound shifted, a faint drag along the porch railing. Then a pause. He pictured someone leaning in, testing the structure, learning the shape of the house through touch alone. The thought made his stomach turn. He moved quietly toward the window beside the door and pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. The porch was empty. The snow had started falling lightly now, thin flakes drifting down in the glow from the kitchen window. They settled undisturbed across the boards. No footprints, no scuffs. No sign that anyone had been there at all. The railing stood untouched. The doorframe showed nothing out of place. The silence felt staged, like a performance resetting between acts. He let the curtain fall back into place. That was when the sound came from the side of the house. A slow crunch, unmistakable, coming from the snow along the wall beneath the living room window. Footsteps this time, measured, deliberate. They moved parallel to the house, close enough that he could hear the compression of snow with each step. Whoever it was didn't rush, didn't sneak. They walked like someone who knew they didn't need to hurry. He followed the sound from inside, moving from window to window, without turning on additional lights. Each time he reached the next pane of glass, the sound had already moved past it. The footsteps stayed just out of view, always one step ahead of his line of sight. Then they stopped, directly beneath the bedroom window. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had. He could almost feel someone standing there, close enough to touch the siding. The smell reached him next. Cold air mixed with something metallic and faintly sour, seeping through cracks he hadn't noticed before. It carried the weight of presence, the unmistakable sense that someone was just outside breathing the same air. He whispered for them to leave, the words barely audible even to himself. The answer came immediately, a single tap on the glass, not a knock, a fingertip. He backed away instinctively, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The tap came again, same spot, same pressure. The sound traveled through the room like a ripple, too soft to be violent, too deliberate to be accidental. Then, the tap slid, slowly, dragging downward across the glass, leaving a faint trail in the condensation from the warm air inside. He stared, frozen, as the line descended to the bottom of the window and stopped. The shape it left behind wasn't random. It curved. As if tracing part of a symbol he couldn't quite recognize, the footsteps returned, retreating this time, moving away from the house toward the road. He waited, barely breathing, listening as the sound faded into the storm. Snow continued to fall, thicker now, softening everything it touched. After several minutes, he forced himself back to the window. The yard was empty again, but the snow beneath the bedroom window was disturbed, compressed, as if someone had stood there for a long time without moving. He stood there longer than he should have, staring at the disturbed snow beneath the bedroom window. The compression was too deep, too centered, as if someone had planted their weight there and waited. Not pacing, not shifting, just standing. The storm erased edges quickly, but that spot held its shape, darker and denser than the surrounding snow. He backed away and locked the bedroom door, even though he knew it wouldn't change much. The house felt smaller now, every room connected by the awareness of being watched. The television murmured in the living room, its light flickering against the walls. He left it on. The sound made the silence easier to tolerate, even as it felt thin and unreliable. The power went out without warning, not a flicker, not a dimming. One moment the room was lit, the next it was swallowed by darkness. The television cut off mid-sentence. The heater died. The sudden quiet hit him hard, like pressure on his ears. He stood frozen, listening, heart pounding so loudly he was sure it could be heard outside. Then the knocking started. It didn't come from the front door, it came from the bedroom window. 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced. Careful. The glass flexed slightly with each one, not enough to crack, but enough to vibrate through the frame. He stepped back until he felt the wall behind him, breath shallow, mind racing. The storm outside had intensified, wind howling now, but the knocks cut through it cleanly, unaffected. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and flicked it on. The beam shook as he moved back toward the bedroom, each step heavier than the last. He aimed the light at the window from several feet away, bracing himself. The glass was intact. The snow on the sill was untouched, but the condensation on the inside of the window had been disturbed. A handprint pressed against it, not smeared, not sliding, pressed. Each finger clearly defined, longer than his own, the spacing slightly off in a way that made his skin crawl. The palm sat too high on the glass, as if whoever made it had been standing taller than the window should have allowed. The knocking came again, this time from the front door. One knock, then another. The The sound traveled through the house differently now, as if the walls carried it intentionally, guiding it toward him. He realized with a surge of cold dread that the sounds were no longer testing the house. They were directing him. He stayed where he was, flashlight fixed on the handprint, refusing to move. The knocking continued, alternating between the door and the window, never overlapping, always spaced just enough to force his attention to shift. The storm raged outside, but the sounds remained precise, controlled, patient. Then something changed. A voice came through the door. Not raised, not threatening, calm. It spoke his name. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Hearing his name spoken that calmly from the other side of a locked door stripped away any remaining illusion that this was a misunderstanding. The voice wasn't muffled by the storm or the thick wood of the house. It carried clearly, evenly, as if the door didn't exist at all. He stood perfectly still, flashlight beam shaking against the window, the handprint slowly fading as the condensation shifted with the cold. Outside, the wind howled harder, rattling the siding, but the voice did not raise itself to compete. It didn't need to. It said his name again. Then it stopped. The knocking stopped too. The house fell into a silence so complete it felt artificial. Even the storm seemed to pull back for a moment, leaving only the faint whistle of wind far off in the dark. He waited, counting his breaths, listening for any sign that whoever was outside had moved away. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Eventually, the power returned with a low surge. Lights flickered back on. The heater clicked, hesitated, then resumed its steady hum. The television rebooted on its own, volume low, filling the house with sound again. Everything looked normal, almost staged that way. He did not open the door. He stayed awake until morning, sitting in the living room with every light on, watching the windows as snow piled up outside. When dawn finally came, the world looked calm again. Clean. The storm had covered everything evenly, smoothing the landscape into something peaceful and quiet. He stepped onto the porch carefully. There were no footprints in the snow, not on the porch, not in the yard, not on the road. The only disturbance was a single patch beneath the bedroom window where the snow had compacted more firmly than anywhere else, already beginning to freeze into solid ice. He contacted authorities later that day. They searched the area. They found nothing. No signs of anyone approaching the house, no evidence of tampering. The report noted weather conditions, possible auditory distortion, and stress due to isolation. He sold the house the following spring. Before leaving for the last time, he walked through every room, checking locks out of habit. When he reached the bedroom, he paused. The window was clear, the glass spotless. But for just a moment, as the heater kicked on, he caught the faint smell of cold metal again, drifting through the room without a source. He never stayed in another house that isolated again, and sometimes, when storms move in and the power flickers, he still hears knocking in the quiet moments that follow. Not loud, not urgent, just patient. She had lived in that house for most of her adult life, long enough that its sounds had blended into routine. The wind that slipped under the eaves during winter, the soft knock of ice shifting on the roof when temperatures dropped suddenly, the way the hallway floor creaked near the bathroom, no matter how carefully you stepped. None of it surprised her anymore. Familiarity was what made the house feel safe. That night, she was alone by circumstance, not choice. Her partner was out of town, delayed by weather, and wouldn't be back until morning. It wasn't unusual. Jackson Hole winters often rearranged plans without warning. She locked the doors before sunset, pulled the curtains closed, and settled into the quiet with a book and a low lamp on the side table. Outside, snow fell steadily, thick enough to soften the world into something muted and distant. The house felt especially still, the kind of stillness that made small noises stand out. She could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen, the heater cycling on and off with a dull metallic click. Every so often, the wind pushed gently against the siding, more a presence than a sound. She welcomed it. Silence felt manageable when it behaved the way it was supposed to. Around 10 p.m., she went through her usual routine, checked the locks, turned off unnecessary lights, made sure the back door was latched properly. The spare bedroom down the hall stayed closed, as it always did. No one used it, Storage had slowly taken over the space. Boxes stacked neatly along the walls, old furniture draped with sheets. The room existed, but it wasn't part of her nightly awareness anymore. She went to bed shortly after, leaving the hallway light on out of habit. The bedroom door stayed open. She liked knowing the space beyond her room was visible, even in shadow. The snow outside reflected just enough light through the curtains to outline the furniture in soft grey shapes. Everything looked as it should. Sleep came easily at first. She woke an hour later without knowing why. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even the heater was off. She lay still, listening, waiting for the sound that must have disturbed her. Nothing came. She closed her eyes again, telling herself it was just one of those half-waking moments that happen when you're alone too long with your thoughts. Then she heard it. A sound from the hallway. Not footsteps, not the creak she expected near the bathroom. It came from farther down near the spare room. A soft shift, like someone adjusting their stance in a place where no one should have been standing. She held her breath and listened harder. The sound didn't repeat right away. It lingered instead, suspended in her awareness, making the hallway feel longer than it actually was. She stared past the foot of her bed toward the open doorway, watching the narrow strip of light spill across the floorboards. Nothing moved. The shadows stayed where they belonged. She told herself it was the house settling. Temperature shifts did that. Wood expanded and contracted. She had lived here long enough to know that. Still, the sound hadn't come from the usual places. It hadn't come from the bathroom corner or the load-bearing beam near the stairs. It had come from the spare room, the room that stayed closed. She sat up slowly, careful not to make noise, and listened again. A faint sound followed, softer than before, almost like fabric brushing against cardboard, too controlled to be random, too slow. It came from behind the closed door at the end of the hall. Her stomach tightened as she realized she could picture the space too clearly. The stacked boxes, the covered chair, the narrow path between them that she had left just wide enough to walk through. She whispered her partner's name without thinking, then immediately felt foolish. She already knew no one else was supposed to be there. The house did not answer her. The silence pressed in, heavier now, as if the space between sounds had weight. She slid out of bed and stood barefoot on the cold floor. The chill grounded her. She moved toward the doorway, one slow step at a time, keeping her eyes fixed down the hall. The spare room door remained closed, the handle catching a faint glint of light. Nothing about it looked disturbed. No movement beneath the door, no shadow leaking through the gap. Another sound came from inside the room. This one was clearer. A soft, deliberate exhale, not loud enough to be unmistakable, but close enough to feel directed. Her pulse jumped, heat rushing into her face. She froze halfway into the hallway, heart pounding so hard she worried it might give her away. She listened again, straining to hear breathing, movement, anything that would confirm what she thought she'd heard. Nothing followed. She told herself she was misinterpreting the noise, that the heater cycling could push air through vents in strange ways. But the heater was still off. The house remained completely still. She glanced toward the thermostat at the other end of the hall. The display was dark. Then the light in the spare room turned on, not fully, just enough to glow faintly beneath the door. The thin line of light under the spare room door should not have been possible. She knew that room. The switch was inside, just to the right of the doorframe. There were no smart lights, no timers, nothing connected remotely. The glow was faint but steady, like a lamp turned low, or a ceiling light filtered through dust and cardboard. Her mouth went dry. She stood in the hallway, frozen between the bedroom and the spare room, listening for movement. The light did not flicker. It did not brighten. It simply existed, as if it had always been there and she was only now noticing it. The longer she stared, the more the hallway seemed to narrow, shadows creeping inward from both sides. She whispered again, this time louder, asking if anyone was there. Her voice sounded wrong, shortened, absorbed by the space before it reached the door. The light dimmed slightly, then it brightened again. The change was subtle, but intentional, like a response. Her heart began to race, panic tightening her chest. She took one step backward toward her bedroom, then stopped, The floorboard beneath her foot creaked sharply in the quiet. The sound echoed down the hallway, louder than it should have been. Inside the spare room, something shifted. Not boxes collapsing, not wood settling, a controlled movement, a weight adjusting its position. The light under the door moved with it, stretching briefly as a shadow passed in front of the source. Her breath hitched. She could now picture someone standing inside that room, surrounded by familiar clutter, using it as cover. The thought made her skin crawl. She reached for her phone, hands trembling. No signal. The screen showed nothing but a faint searching icon that never resolved. She tried again, stepping closer to the front of the house where reception was sometimes better. The light under the spare room door brightened as she moved away from it, the glow spreading slightly wider across the floor. It was following her. She backed up slowly until she felt the bedroom doorframe against her shoulder. The spare room door remained closed. The handle did not turn. Nothing forced its way out. Whatever was inside did not need to. The pressure in the hallway grew heavier, thick enough to feel against her skin. The air smelled different now, faintly metallic, cold and stale, like a room that hadn't been opened in years. She considered running for the front door. The thought barely formed before she dismissed it. To reach it, she would have to pass the spare room, walk directly in front of the door, put herself within arm's reach of whatever stood behind it. Her body refused the idea completely. The light under the door went out. The hallway plunged into darkness. At the same moment, the sound came from inside the room. A single knock, from the wrong side of the door. The knock wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried through the hallway with a clarity that made her flinch, a controlled sound placed exactly where it would be felt most. Not a fist, not a pounding. A single deliberate contact against the wood, as if testing thickness rather than asking to be let out. She backed into the bedroom and pushed the door closed without slamming it, turning the lock with shaking fingers. The click sounded too loud in the silence. She stood there for a second, listening, heart hammering, waiting for something to rush her. Nothing did. The house felt suspended again, like it was holding its breath. Then the hallway floor creaked, slowly, one board at a time. The sound moved toward her bedroom door, stopping just outside it. She pressed her palm against the door, feeling the vibration of movement on the other side. The smell intensified immediately, that same metallic coldness seeping through the crack beneath the door, crawling into the room like a presence that didn't need permission. She whispered for it to stop. The whisper came back to her. Not repeated, not mocked, returned. Same tone, same pace, close enough that it sounded like it came from inside the room with her. Her breath caught painfully in her chest. She covered her mouth with both hands to keep from making another sound. Something brushed the bedroom door, not the handle, the surface, slow, dragging. As if a hand, or something shaped like one, was being drawn across the wood, learning its edges. The door bowed slightly under pressure, not enough to give, but enough to remind her how thin it really was. The ceiling light flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The room fell into darkness, broken only by the gray glow of snowlight pushing through the curtains. Shapes flattened, depth vanished. She crouched beside the bed, knees pulled tight to her chest, listening to the space beyond the door. A breath came from the hallway, deep, satisfied. The handle turned, not forced, tested. The lock held, but the movement continued, patient, unhurried, as if whoever was outside had no doubt it would eventually open. The door shuddered once as pressure leaned against it, then eased away. Footsteps retreated, not fast, not disappointed. They moved back down the hallway toward the spare room, boards creaking softly beneath each step. She stayed frozen, afraid that moving too soon would bring it back. The smell faded slowly. The pressure lifted inch by inch until the house felt hollow again. Minutes passed, maybe more. She didn't check the time. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, not sleep, just numb stillness. She stayed there until the gray light outside shifted toward morning, until the house noises returned to something that felt normal again. When daylight finally filled the room, she unlocked the door. The hallway was empty. The spare room door stood open. The light inside was off. The boxes were exactly where she remembered them, except for one. A single box sat in the center of the room, pulled away from the wall, its lid open. Inside it lay nothing she owned. She stood in the doorway of the spare room for a long time without stepping inside. The air felt colder there, heavier, as if the room had not fully returned to being empty. The open box sat perfectly centered on the floor, placed with intention rather than carelessness. The cardboard edges were crisp, no dust disturbed around it, no sign of how it had been moved. Inside the box was a folded piece of fabric, dark, thick, not clothing she recognized. She did not touch it. She did not need to. The smell told her enough. That same metallic coldness clung to it, stronger here than anywhere else in the house. It filled the room in a way that made her eyes water and her throat tighten. She backed away slowly and closed the door. Later that morning, after daylight had fully settled in, she called a friend and asked them to come over. She did not explain why. She only said she did not want to be alone. When her friend arrived, the house felt normal again. Warm, quiet in the way homes are supposed to be. Together they searched every room, every closet, every crawl space. They found nothing out of place. When they returned to the spare room, the box was gone. The floor showed no marks, no scuffs, no signs that anything had been dragged across it. The door stood exactly where she had left it, closed but unlocked. Her friend suggested stress, sleep disruption, the mind filling in gaps during long winter nights. She nodded and let the explanation sit, even though it did not fit what she had seen. She did not sleep in that house again. By the end of the week, she packed essentials and left, telling herself it was temporary. She listed the house for sale in the spring. It sold quickly. The new owners never reported any issues, at least none that reached her. But sometimes when she lies awake in unfamiliar rooms, she notices something small that makes her chest tighten. A shadow where no object should cast one. A room that feels occupied even when it is empty. A smell that reminds her of cold metal and old air. She has learned not to check unused rooms anymore, because the most frightening part was not the sounds or the light or the knock on the door. It was the certainty that whatever had been in that house did not need to break in. It already knew where everything was. The emergency started as something small. That was the part that stayed with her later. Not a crash, not a scream. Just a sharp pain low in her side while she was alone in the house, the kind that makes you stop what you're doing and wait for it to pass. She lived outside Jackson Hole proper, far enough that neighbors were a concept more than a reality. Winter had settled in hard that week. Snowbanks pressed high against the edges of the property, and the road leading out had already been reduced to a single narrow lane. She tried to ignore the pain at first, sat down, took a breath, told herself it was nothing serious. But it didn't fade. It deepened, spread. Each movement made it worse, and within minutes she was sweating despite the cold, heart racing with the awareness that something was wrong. She reached for her phone and dialed for help. The call connected, but the signal was weak. The operator's voice cut in and out, words dissolving into static. She gave her address twice before it seemed to register. The response time was long. Weather delays, road conditions, at least an hour, maybe more. She hung up and locked the door, not because she felt threatened, because that's what you do when you're alone and vulnerable. The house felt too quiet now, every sound amplified by pain and waiting. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows, pushing snow against the walls. She lay back on the couch, phone in hand, watching the minutes crawl by. That was when she heard movement outside, not close, at the edge of the property. Slow footsteps compressing snow in a way that suggested weight and intention. She told herself it was a responder arriving early, hope flaring despite logic. She tried to sit up, pain flaring sharply as she shifted. The footsteps stopped, right outside the front of the house. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps didn't approach the porch. They didn't circle the house. They simply stopped, as if whoever stood outside had reached a precise point and decided that was close enough. Snow brushed softly against the siding as the wind shifted, but beneath it, there was a presence that felt deliberate and still. She called out through the door, voice strained, asking if someone was there. The words sounded thin even to her own ears. No answer came back. not a greeting, not reassurance. Nothing that confirmed the figure outside was human at all. Her phone vibrated suddenly in her hand. Not a call, a notification. An incoming message that didn't load fully, the screen stuttering as the signal struggled. The preview showed only a fragment of text before freezing. No name, no number. Just a single line that read, "I can hear you moving." Her chest tightened painfully. She hadn't moved since the footsteps stopped. She hadn't even shifted her weight. The house creaked softly as it always did, but that was all. She locked the screen and tried to call back emergency services. The line rang once, then dropped. Outside, the footsteps resumed, not toward the door, away from it. They moved along the side of the house, slow and steady, close enough that she could hear the snow compress with each step. The sound followed the wall, passing beneath the living room window, then the kitchen. She dragged herself off the couch despite the pain and peered through the curtain. She saw nothing. The snowfall had thickened, blurring the yard into a pale haze. No shape stood out. No shadow moved. But the footsteps continued, stopping just beneath the bedroom window. She knew that window well. It faced the side yard, the narrow strip of snow between the house and the trees. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. This one longer, but still incomplete as it struggled to load. The words appeared slowly, letter by letter, as if being typed in real time. "Don't open the door." Her pulse spiked. She hadn't mentioned the door. She hadn't told anyone she was alone. She hadn't shared anything beyond an address and a request for help. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. The footsteps shifted again, this time closer, directly beneath the window. She pulled the curtain back just enough to look. The snow there was disturbed, pressed down into a single darkened patch, as if someone had stood in one place without moving. No footprints led away from it. No tracks approached from the trees. Just that one compressed space, perfectly positioned below the glass. The phone vibrated once more. The message loaded fully this time. Help isn't coming yet. Her breathing became shallow and uneven as the pain in her side pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The message replayed itself in her mind, the certainty of it more frightening than the words themselves. Help isn't coming yet. It wasn't phrased as a threat, it wasn't phrased as reassurance either. It sounded like information, like someone who already knew the outcome. Outside, the presence shifted again. The snow compressed slightly deeper beneath the window, followed by a faint scrape against the siding. Not a knock, not a scratch. Something brushing the walls slowly, deliberately, testing the texture. The sound traveled upward, stopping just below the glass. She pulled back from the window, clutching the phone tightly, knuckles white. She tried calling again. The phone rang twice this time before dissolving into static. The operator's voice broke through for a second, distant and distorted, then vanished. The call ended on its own. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, thick enough to press against her ears. Another message arrived. "You should stay where you are." She felt tears sting her eyes, frustration mixing with fear. Whoever was outside knew too much, knew where she was in the house, knew she was injured, knew the timing. The realization settled into her chest like weight, making it harder to breathe. She dragged herself toward the kitchen, pain flaring sharply with each movement, and grabbed the largest knife from the drawer. Her hand shook as she held it. The footsteps moved again. This time they circled the house, slowly, evenly, each step spaced perfectly, as if measured. She could track the movement by sound alone as it passed each window in turn. The crunch of snow never faltered, never hurried. Whoever was outside had no concern about being seen. The lights flickered, once, twice. The heater cut off abruptly, plunging the house into colder silence. Her phone screen dimmed as the battery drained faster than it should have. She checked it. Less than 10% remaining. The messages had stopped coming, but the presence outside remained constant, its movement mapping the house with patience. The footsteps stopped at the front door. She stared at it, heart pounding, waiting for the knock that didn't come. Instead, something pressed gently against the door from the outside. Not enough to force it, just enough to remind her how thin the barrier was. The pressure lingered for several seconds, then eased away. Her phone vibrated one last time. "I'll wait." The footsteps retreated toward the edge of the property, fading into the storm. She collapsed back onto the couch, knife still in hand, shaking uncontrollably. Minutes passed, then more. The pain blurred into something distant, replaced by exhaustion and fear. She did not know how long she lay there before she heard an engine. Real this time. Headlights cut through the snowfall outside, followed by voices shouting her name. Relief crashed over her so hard she sobbed openly. By the time responders reached her, the house was quiet again, warm, normal. They found no footprints outside, no disturbed snow, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But when they loaded her into the ambulance, one of the responders paused near the front door and frowned. There, pressed faintly into the inside of the wood, was a handprint, from the wrong side. They lifted her onto the stretcher carefully, voices calm, practiced, focused on stabilizing her pain. The warmth of the ambulance wrapped around her as soon as they closed the doors, cutting her off from the cold and the house behind her. For the first time in what felt like hours, she allowed herself to believe it was over, that whatever had been outside was gone, that the waiting had ended. As the vehicle pulled away, she stared through the rear window at her house shrinking into the snowfall. The porch light glowed softly, illuminating the front door. For a brief second, something about the doorframe looked wrong, a darker shape where the wood met the glass. She blinked, and the moment passed, swallowed by distance and snow. Inside the ambulance, a responder asked her questions. Name, age, allergies. She answered automatically, voice thin but steady. When they asked what happened before they arrived, she hesitated. She didn't know how to explain it. She settled for saying she felt unsafe, that she believed someone had been outside the house. The responder exchanged a glance with his partner, but said nothing. Her phone lay on the bench beside her, battery nearly dead. The screen lit up one last time as the ambulance hit a bump in the road. A notification appeared briefly before the device powered off completely. A final message. "You're not alone yet." She gasped, clutching at the blanket, panic surging fresh and sharp. She tried to tell them what she had seen, but the words tangled in her throat. The responder assured her she was safe now, that no one could reach her here, that everything would be checked. They arrived at the hospital shortly after. Bright lights, clean smells, the steady rhythm of machines. The world snapped back into something structured and logical. Doctors took over. Questions became clinical. Time blurred. Hours later, when the pain was finally under control and the fear had dulled into exhaustion, a sheriff's deputy came to speak with her. He told her they had returned to the property after she was transported. They searched the perimeter thoroughly despite the storm. There were no signs of anyone approaching or leaving the house. No footprints, no disturbances. The road was untouched. She asked about the door. The deputy paused. He told her there had been a mark, very faint, on the inside of the front door. Not fresh damage, not something you could photograph easily, just an impression, like pressure applied and released. Too high to belong to a child, too narrow to match her own hand. When she asked what he thought it meant, he shook his head. He said sometimes fear leaves marks too. But as he stood to leave, he added one more thing. The emergency call log showed something strange. A second signal had briefly pinged from her address that night. Not a phone call, a response. She was discharged 2 days later. The doctors called it an acute medical episode brought on by stress and weather complications. Pain, isolation, exhaustion. A combination that could blur perception. They spoke gently, confidently, as if certainty itself could smooth the edges of what she remembered. She nodded and signed the papers. It was easier than trying to explain something that never behaved like an event. It behaved like a presence. A friend stayed with her the first night back home. The house felt different now, smaller, too exposed. Every sound carried too clearly through the rooms. They checked the doors together. The locks were solid, the windows intact. The front door showed nothing unusual in daylight. No handprint, no mark, just wood, worn smooth by years of use. That night passed without incident. So did the next. but the phone never worked the same again. Even after replacing it, she noticed odd behavior. Missed calls that never rang, messages marked as read that she had never opened. Once, late at night, the screen lit up on its own and went dark again before she could see what had triggered it. The service provider found nothing wrong. No record of incoming texts at those times, no second number attached to her account. She moved out before the winter ended. The house sold quickly, despite the season. She didn't tell the new owners anything beyond routine details. They didn't need to carry what she carried. When she left for the last time, she stood on the porch and listened. The wind moved through the trees. Snow creaked softly beneath her boots. Everything behaved exactly the way it was supposed to. Months later, she received a voicemail from a number she didn't recognize. No voice spoke. It was only background sound, wind, a faint crunch of snow, and then, very quietly, the sound of a door being pressed from the inside. The call ended on its own. She deleted the message immediately, but the sound stayed with her. The certainty of it. The feeling that whatever had been waiting that night had not been driven away by sirens or snow or daylight. Only delayed. She does not live alone anymore. She avoids places where help takes time to arrive. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and her phone lights up unexpectedly, she waits before looking at it. Because the most unsettling part was never the messages, or the footsteps, or the mark on the door. It was the knowledge that something responded to her call for help, and it knew exactly when to answer.